Hi everyone, welcome to the Sustainable Supply Chain Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today I have my special guest Matthew. Matthew, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks Tom. Thanks a lot for inviting me on the show. So indeed, Matthew Van Niekerk. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Settlemint. I'm originally from Canada, live in Belgium now. But yeah, happy to be here and have a good discussion about supply chain and sustainability.
Fantastic. And what, Matthew, for people who are unaware, is Settlemint?
Yeah, so Settlemint is a company that I started back in 2016. It's a platform that makes it really easy to build blockchain applications. It's a blockchain transformation platform. So if companies want to integrate blockchain functionalities into existing applications and workflows, if they don't have the in-house talent to do that, then any of their developers, their Web2 developers, can be transformed. It's kind of like a jetpack for those guys to become a Web3 developer. So we make it super easy with the platform to integrate blockchain functionalities for companies to integrate blockchain functionalities into their business.
Okay, is it kind of low code, no code?
It has, I would say it's low, certainly not no code, but low code inspired, I would say. But so we played on that balance between low code, no code for many years now. And when you get into no code, and then as a developer, you find yourself very quickly painted into a corner. So I'm trying to do something that's specific to my organization, but the template's not there. So the template doesn't fit it, and I need to throw that out and start from scratch. Low code is a little bit better in that a lot of the heavy lifting is done, but often the full customization is not possible. So we're kind of a little bit, we're a development environment where I can use the templates, but I can fully customize them. So we want to avoid that painting a developer into a corner where he can't or she can't do exactly what she wants. So yeah, we have the templates, low-code type approach, but then we say, okay, well, here's the source code. And then they can make all the full customizations that they want.
Okay, fair enough. And why? What's the kind of origin story? What made you sit up one day and go, I know, I should start Settlemint?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, no, before starting Settlemint, I spent about 12 years in banking and financial services.
Commiserations.
And yeah. So I like to say I've officially done my time, so I'm out. But still working with a lot of banks. But yeah, no, it was a great experience. And in 2014 or so, I got into blockchain technology at the bank, and I was working in capital markets and kind of on the border between business and IT. And wore an innovation manager hat at the time. And so in that, I was looking at a lot of different technologies, but blockchain really caught me. I thought working in capital markets, it was always, when you see how you can gain efficiencies by working peer-to-peer instead of like a P to B to B to B to B to B to B to P, that kind of a scenario, which the capital markets is today. There's a lot of efficiencies that can be gained, replacing intermediaries and things like that. So I got caught by this technology and said, okay, well, financial markets transactions usually take T+2 or T+3 if it's a liquid asset. So from the moment the trade is done, it still takes 2 to 3 days to finally clear and settle a trade. And there are a lot of historical reasons and controls that are put in place that were put in place before the internet and computers existed that have, from a regulatory perspective, been kind of enforced ever since. So I saw this technology, okay, the whole philosophy of it, connecting different parties peer-to-peer without intermediaries, and thought, okay, this back in 2014, I need to learn a lot more about this and better understand what can this mean for financial markets. That's where my starting point. So I started together with a couple of other colleagues, Center of Excellence for Blockchain Technology at the bank.
Right.
I was focused, of course, on capital markets. Others were focused on different areas like trade finance and payments and insurance. But for my part, I'm a doer. I like to build things and get things built. And so I very quickly understood, okay, there's a number of areas where we might be able to utilize this technology to become more efficient, to pull out or remove the need for intermediaries and all kinds of stuff like that. So I we had, around 2,000 developers in-house. And so I launched a call to action or a call for support. I called it, please join the coalition of the willing. I want to build some experiments with blockchain tech. And so we had a first meeting. There was some interest. And I said, okay, there's I've got a list of 8 use cases that I think might be interesting. We're going to start with the first 3. And the first question that I was asked by the engineers, who were very competent, very capable developers, was like, block what? So
Oh dear.
it was, yeah. And so there's a huge skill gap, and it persists today. Less than 1% of developers in Europe have experience with blockchain technology or have the competence and skill to build a production-grade application with blockchain tech. So, I went down a number of paths trying to close that gap. Of course, the first thing you do is, okay, well, let's invest in training, get the skills and capabilities in-house up. But of course, after, let's say, 12 months of training, these guys are competent, and they've just made themselves the most highly sought-after developers in the market. So they leave. And so that's kind of a painful journey to invest 12 months in getting the skills in-house, and then they leave. So what's the next option? Well, there are lots of consultancies like IBM or Accenture or Deloitte that had blockchain teams. Okay, let's work. And then, you start the process with them, and they're like, okay, to do a proof of concept, it's going to take around 8 to 12 months. And we're going to have, like 6 people working on it. And it's like, you can assume or infer what the budgets of those kind of experiments would be. And I thought, okay, this is not a viable option. There's no way I'm going to get budget for this. And I was, so my origin story of this on my side as the CEO of the company is, hitting the wall about 50 times trying to get blockchain stuff started at a bank. And I thought, okay, there's got to be a better way, not just a better way, there's got to be a different way. And so that's where the idea of Settlemint came about, to build a platform that would make it easy for any of the 2,000 developers we had at the bank in Belgium to be able to build those applications. And that was where the concept was born. My co-founder, Roderick, I was working with him in a vendor-client relationship. He was CTO of another company and agency in Belgium. And so we'd been working together for 3 years. When I was trying to do those experiments, one of my other approaches was, okay, I'll just see if one of our other vendors can work on it. And so I said to him, like, one of the first case I said to him was, okay, we've launched a crowdfunding platform to fund pre-IPO companies. Can you build a secondary market for that using blockchain tech? And so he went away, did some R&D work, and came back, and 6 weeks later called me up and said, okay, I got an MVP, come check it out. And so ever since then, it's just been like, okay. And when I pitched to Roderick to start the company, and both of us had pretty good careers going, and we're just like, I said, Roderick, here's the vision. What do you think? And this is in my backyard at a barbecue over a beer, that type of thing. But and he said, look, I was 15 when the internet went boom, and so I was a bit too young to catch that wave. There's no way in hell I'm missing the second wave. So yeah, we both left our jobs and started Settlemint with the singular ambition: make it easy to build blockchain applications.
Okay. And this is the Sustainable Supply Chain podcast, Matthew. So what are you doing here?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting is supply chain in particular is there's some challenges that are faced in supply chain, and specifically around data that as it flows throughout a supply chain, that I think blockchain offers a solid solution for. And how, so that's why the first part about supply chain, right? So I think some of our work, quite a bit of our work, about 40% of what we do over the last 8 years has been centered around how do I get information from upstream and downstream, or sorry, from upstream suppliers into how do I get that information, and how do I then capture it, and how can I trust it? And so that, when you talk about what are the principles behind blockchain, it's okay, trust and transparency. Use a common ledger to record information across multiple parties, and that's the peer-to-peer nature of it. So what I see, the utilization of blockchain technology to act as an efficient data capture mechanism is very powerful in supply chains. So that's the first part about, why talking about blockchain in supply chain. I kind of sometimes look at it like you can almost view blockchain technology as a very effective systems integration tool. And when those systems are across organizational boundaries, that's where it really shines. And that's where it really starts to make sense. So how do I capture information in a network, in a supply chain, that everybody should have a common view of the truth? And and for the current state and things like that. So that's where blockchain fits for me in supply chain. And on the sustainability side, it kind of, and I'll maybe give an example, like where does the sustainability start to come into play? And it's actually for the same reasons, collecting information throughout a supply chain, being able to independently verify that data as when you have access to it. Those are the attributes. And we were working with AB InBev, so the largest brewer in the world, and we worked with them for one of their brands, and they wanted to be able to collect data throughout the supply chain for barley. So they've got, across Europe, something like 10,000 farms that are providing barley to them.
Okay.
I was shocked. I was like, wow, that's a lot of barley. But, and they wanted, and specifically in France is where we targeted with the first implementation and the first piloting. But they have this network of farmers that are providing barley, and they want to be able to. What started as like quite a simple supply chain tracking use case evolved into more of a sustainability angle as well, and I'll explain how that went. So, if you want to get from the 100 farmers, and the initial drive was to provide a more engaging brand experience. So it was the brand Leffe.
Oh yeah.
And the project was to be able to trace the origins of the barley that go into Leffe. And as it goes through, from the farm to the cooperative to the silos where they store the grain to the malt, through the malting process, eventually to the brewery, and then the distribution, so that as a consumer of the beer, I can really understand the journey. And this is important, and that on itself is, these kind of use cases, we started doing them back in 2018 already, but AB InBev was a little bit later. But providing that truth and trust and transparency throughout the supply chain is increasingly important today. Like if I say it's locally sourced, prove it. If I'm a provider, like how do I prove that? And I think you can slap a label on any package and say it's locally sourced, but how do you, as a consumer, a discerning consumer wants proof? And the way that you can do that with blockchain is that if there's a QR code on it, then I can independently verify from the chain and reconstruct all the data of that product throughout the supply chain about where it came from. And AB InBev is one example. Another one we did is, and I'll get back to the sustainability part. But once you get that, the initiatives that have been really interesting in kind of layering different types of utility that can be derived by using this technology is where it gets interesting. So the first phase is getting that time stamping throughout the process and being able to reconstruct that for the consumer so that they scan a QR code on the product and then, okay, this is the farmer that produced the barley that went into my beer. And what AB InBev did, which was really cool, they added also other things to build engagement, and that was like including recipes for food pairings that go well with Leffe. So consumers will spend time if they're a Leffe fan. Okay, that kind of a stew. What's the recipe for that? And then they can look it up and create the meal. And this creates a lot of brand value for AB InBev and specifically the brand Leffe. Now, once you get that network in place to start collecting that data, then it's okay. Then in the future, it's like, what kind of data are we collecting? And as time has gone on, and increasingly, the importance of not just time stamping and meeting the farmer and recipes, but also ESG data becomes, and sustainability related data becomes increasingly important.
Sure.
And with legislations that are coming in Europe that are like the CSRD, if the fines and penalties that can be levied if I'm non-compliant are significant. If you take not AB InBev or others, but a lot of companies are operating on a few percentage points of margin, and if they get a fine for 4 or 5 or 6%, whatever the number is, they could go from a profit making to loss making. So there's a big drive right now to be able to comply with legislation, of course. Now, how do you collect that data? Because the most difficult part of that data is Scope 3, I think. Mm-hmm. Getting Scope 3 emissions data from my supply chain, I've got two options. Either I use a carrot or I use a stick, right? And I most...
Or a combination.
Yeah, or a combination, yeah. A hybrid approach, yeah. But I think some of the companies we're working with, they were using a stick. And if you're not compliant and you're not providing this data, then you're down in the list of the 7 suppliers we have for what you're producing. So yeah, and these kind of weights and scales are put in place for vendor selection and things like that. So now that's the stick approach. But now if I've got that kind of a network in place, then I can also start collecting additional information in an efficient way from my suppliers. And if but also standardized way. That's a huge thing, to have the standardized formats. I think that's the ESRD and how it needs to be reported. But we can start, putting in place the network that they're already using to provide information about the timestamps, to start collecting the sustainability or ESG related information. And once they start doing that, I can start offering incentives back to them through that same network. So that changes the paradigm a bit, either going from stick to carrot or going from part stick, part carrot, as you said, kind of a hybrid solution. So I think we've seen this evolution in the market with blockchain and supply chain, where it started as very much a story of consumer engagement and things like that, moving to reporting for compliance on sustainability initiatives, which then adds in the dimension of being able to offer a carrot instead of only using a stick. And then the third wave that this is more speculative, but what I think is going to happen is banks are not sitting on the sideline waiting for some kind of regulation to hit with them either as well. They're starting to, the increased interest in offering sustainability-linked financial products is huge. Mm-hmm. So there's a growing interest in that. And I think the most efficient way to do that will just be to start, and that can be in the form, one example that we were looking at is a working capital solution. So if you look at, and I'll go back to the AB InBev example, if you take AB InBev, they're a huge tier one banking client, right? And all of their suppliers could potentially need working capital solutions. Yep. And to get a sustainability linked financial product like a working capital solution, I need the data, because there'll be covenants that are in those agreements, whether that's for working capital or for loans. There's a reporting requirement around ESG that'll be linked to it. So again, it's all about the data flows, and whether it's for trust and transparency with consumers, whether it's for collecting sustainability relevant information and ESG relevant information, or it's offering incentives, or it's offering, and a great incentive, well, maybe that's another form of the carrot. It's if I can offer a working capital solution for providing the data, if a company like AB InBev is working together with a large bank, then they can offer this product. And then that creates the incentive mechanisms to bring people on board to report accurately, correctly, and persistently on sustainability data.
Okay, interesting. And is it just, I've seen several examples of supply chain and blockchain coming together. The majority of the instances I've seen are in the food and beverage area. I'm assuming a lot of that is down to the kind of increased requirement to be able to demonstrate farm to fork or farm to beer bottle or farm to pint glass, whatever it is.
Farm to fridge.
Exactly. Are there other areas that it's impacting as well, or why is it just food and beverage that I'm seeing? Am I missing something, or is it primarily that, or what's your take there?
Yeah, I think I'll give a short answer would be, I would say until now, most of it has been in the food and beverage industry. And I think if I had to kind of put my finger on what's the reason for that, I think actually, I'm not going to even speculate because I'd probably get it wrong. but when we talk about, and it's not different for other products, but I'm just thinking, what could it be, like health and safety concerns around food? And it's also possible that in the food and beverage sector, the consumers are becoming more discerning about the origins of what they're eating and what impact is it having on society. Whereas maybe for other products, it's not seen as. I'm speculating, sure. So maybe. But I think that might have something to do with it. And it's consumers are eating food and beverage every day. It's the most shortest. It's generally 3 times a day. So generally, that might be the first consumer product area that people feel they can have an impact. And then, does that mean that it's not happening in other sectors? No, that's certainly not the case. There's a lot of examples in mining as well. Okay. A lot of interest in tracking and tracing where conflict minerals come from, and were they ethically sourced. These kind of things are really, we see a lot of interest there. But also there's another initiative we're starting for battery lifecycle management. Right. And tracking and tracing, where did the battery come from? Where did the minerals that went into the battery come from? But not stopping at, the manufactured battery, but that battery is then imported to a country. Then there's the distributor in the country. Then there's the installer, the inspector, the maintenance people. And then that battery eventually reaches end of life and it's recycled or disposed of in some way. And that's where, we just just kicking off an initiative to do kind of that circular flow for batteries. So that's another example that I can speak to.
Yeah, because there's the whole EV passport legislation issue coming on board, right? I'm sure. Is that what's kicking off your interest in batteries?
Well, definitely. And I should say, as Settlemint, we wouldn't build such a solution generally by ourselves. So we're working with a consortium of around, I think it's 4 players right now that are in that industry in this country and that want to be prepared for when enforcement of the battery regulation will be in place. And that's not too far off. So they're getting started on getting ready to be compliant.
Okay. And does that apply to, is it just EV batteries or is it batteries in general?
Yeah, no, sorry. For the first phase, it's home batteries. So batteries that are installed in somebody's house, they've got solar panels and all that stuff. Yeah. And then, but of course, once the model is built, then it's not a big leap to apply that to solar panels or car batteries might be it would be a different workflow, of course. But yeah, it's the same concept. It's product passports indeed.
Yeah. What about the pharma industry? Because obviously, if I'm thinking food and beverage, my suspicion would be there that people care about that because it's something that's going into your body, and pharma similarly, and even more importantly, in many cases, I would have thought, is it breaking into the pharma space as well?
It is, and there's a global organization called Pharma Ledger that really focuses on blockchain applications only in the pharmaceutical sector. So indeed, and whether I think I was reading what was that statistic? Something like 20 to 25% of medicines that are distributed in I think it was Middle East Africa region are counterfeit. There was some WHO study on that. And that's a huge risk. So I think being able to prove the provenance of medicines is a great use case. Yeah, and I think that's in reaction to things like that an organization like Pharma Ledger set up to have pharma-specific implementations on chain.
Okay. And where is this all headed? I mean, is it going to be blockchain for everything, or is it just going to be sticking with food, bev, a bit of pharma, and a bit of EV battery or battery in general? Where are we going to fall on that kind of spectrum?
Yeah. No, I think blockchain's a tool, right? Like it's not a silver bullet for everything. It's a tool in the toolbox, and it should be applied where it makes sense. And so will it, blockchain everywhere if it makes sense? Yeah. I mean, why not? If it's gaining efficiencies, if it's making data, not just data transmission, but data verification, if it's improving those processes, therefore improving the security of systems and the ability of companies to access the data and for consumers to access the data and independently verify it, then any industry where that's relevant, I think, is a candidate to use blockchain where it makes sense, though, of course.
Right. And go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to, because I think in the ESG or sustainability, I like to look at it from one use case, if you don't mind, just where there's, because I've heard there've been a lot of high profile kind of blow ups or implosions of blockchain initiatives in supply chain or in trade finance and things like that. And when I looking back, and if you look at the postmortems that are written about these initiatives, quite often it's that if you kind of summarize it, they try to kind of eat the elephant in one bite instead of taking it step by step and taking a small piece where it really makes sense and then going and scaling it out where it makes sense. But where does it have real impact? So I've mentioned a couple of things about EV and the case of being able to create better incentive mechanisms for providing information. But there's another one that we worked on that's been live for already 2 years in India. That's the state of Jharkhand. And in the state of Jharkhand, I think it's 70% of the GDP of the state of Jharkhand is agriculture.
Okay.
And what the state does there is they provide seeds to local farmers. And there are about 7 different steps in the distribution process. And of course, all the seeds that are distributed by the state are quality controlled. So there's no spurious seeds in the supply chain that's coming from them. But what happens in such a scenario is that, and every farmer is uniquely identified with the system they call the Aadhaar. That's both a paper and a digital identity. 98% of the population is onboarded to that platform. So what happens in this seed distribution process and the seed supply chain then for the farmers is that if I have an entitlement for so much seed, but if somebody further up the supply chain or one step away from me prefers to give my seeds to somebody else, I've got a very tough path to follow to get what I'm entitled to and prove that I didn't get it. So that was one thing. Another thing that was happening, there's three parts to the story, but the first was not getting the correct allocation or not getting an allocation. The second is about spurious seeds entering the supply chain at one of those intermediary steps. So and of course, when you inject spurious seeds, let's say in step 2 or 3 of the supply chain, then there's potential and risk that everything for the remaining steps is contaminated because the spurious seeds, whatever disease they have, spreads to the rest of the supply chain of the seeds that are being distributed. Sure. The third thing is that the state itself, who's doing the distribution, they had a really difficult time getting accurate reporting on the distribution itself because with so many different intermediaries involved, or so many steps in that supply chain and distribution chain, collecting, once it's done, okay, then we report on it. And that might take, 3 weeks, a month to get all the data back, and then another week or two to finalize and consolidate all the information and hope, and that's when all of the information was, there's no discrepancies, right? Sure. So it's really an inefficient process to say, well, how successful was our seed distribution for this season? And so those were the kind of the conditions of that. And then the question comes, can we do this more efficiently with blockchain? And we worked very closely with the state, built a technical solution for that, and then worked hand in hand. We did I think it was close to 30 train the trainer sessions, each of them having about 20 to 25 representatives from the government that were then going to train throughout the supply chain on how to utilize the solution. So, the result of that is that today there's about 1.7 million farmers that are onboarded onto this platform. I think I always get shocked by the numbers, but it's something like 300 or 30 million, I think it's 30 million kilos of seed has been distributed using it. And now, so what's the result of that? Okay, when seed is flowing through, when it's received by the farmer using their Aadhaar, that's uniquely identified as, okay, did they get their allocation? Yes or no? We can immediately prove that. The second, about the control on spurious seeds entering the supply chain, well, that's no longer a factor because if they're not registered as fully tested seeds, then they don't get passed on from one step to the next. And in terms of the state being able to say, well, was our distribution successful? There's no more collection of data from all those intermediaries and aggregation and quality checking. It's just, okay, these actions throughout the supply chain are recorded immediately. As soon as the farmer gets the seed, we can update the report. And so anyways, there's a lot of benefit that's coming. And of course, what's the bigger picture here? In the real story, it's about we're having, by implementing in this way and with the way that it's working, this is having direct impact on the livelihood of local communities in India. And that's, people that are dependent on this seed distribution to feed their family, to feed their community. They can, there's a lot higher probability that they're going to be able to do that now without any disruption in the supply chain. So there's a lot of real efficiency gain, but the part that I like is the human impact, and that's from a sustainability perspective. Then and if we talk about ESG, more on the S side, I would say, sure. But having a real social impact on improving the livelihoods of farmers in rural India and the state of Jharkhand, that's really, I think it's a great example of how blockchain can be used in supply chain. Again, it's an agricultural use case, mm-hmm. But the impact is so clear and transparent that it's really, I think, a good example of how this technology can have impact.
Okay. Could this be transferred, this kind of technology be transferred into other industries where it allows transparency of data across suppliers and end-tier supply chains? Because that's really the issue, isn't it? For a lot of reporting, it's lack of visibility of all kinds of information, emissions particularly, but all kinds of information down through end-tier supply chains.
Yeah. The short answer is yes, for sure. Why do I say that so kind of confidently? I think it's fine to be able to report, but I mean, there's enough examples in other industries, automotive in particular, where companies are falsifying information about, have had issues with falsification of test results,
Sure.
for example.
Dieselgate, famously.
And voila, yeah. So, and I won't. Yeah, I didn't want to mention. Didn't want to mention the manufacturer, but you know who we're talking about. But at any rate, I think when you can connect, how can blockchain have an impact when you remove the human intermediary in the provisioning of data, i.e., connecting directly through sensors and IoT to information flowing on chain. Then there's it's less manual work, and the probability of let's call it human error entering the process is essentially removed. So I think that might also be a reason, coming back to why is it less prevalent in other sectors. Maybe it's the implementation might be slightly more complex, more integration work required and things like that. But I think that when you can get the information coming straight from the source, and that source is a machine or a sensor, and then it's not just blockchain. Then you start applying AI to see, are there anomalies in the data that might indicate that there's something either defective with the device, or somebody's surrounded the device with an oxygen infusing device that will then make the CO2 level seem lower, whatever it might be. But you can start to apply not just blockchain, but AI and machine learning to start to have data that can be trusted and data that can be independently verified.
Sure.
And whether that independent verification is by a consumer, a regulator, and of course the company itself, or independent watchdogs. But I mean, the point is to get the data in a form that is, when it should be provided publicly, it is provided publicly, and not just a company saying, here's my data, but here's independently verifiable data that from different types of analysis can be proven that it's of course, I shouldn't overemphasize. Well, I shouldn't make it sound better than it is. But I mean, blockchain is garbage in, garbage out. Yep. So if something is recorded that's wrong, then it's recorded wrong. But the blockchain doesn't know and doesn't care. It's just the information is recorded. Yep. So I think that's where controls in different systems to detect anomalies are important to have in place in such a system as well. But yeah, I think other industries for sure. I think the implementations could be a bit more complex due to the integration with different devices, and by doing that, also the potential need to apply other technologies like AI and machine learning to detect anomalies and make sure that alerts and triggers are set up for that. But just a few thoughts to share on other industries as well.
Cool. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, Matthew. Is there any question I didn't ask that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
Yeah, I think, and maybe just go back to something I mentioned earlier. It's I think supply chains have been working, and maybe I'll elaborate a bit, but keep it short because we're running out of coming to the end. But indeed, I think supply chains have worked for centuries, for millennia, right? And blockchain technology hasn't been part of that story. So do supply chains work without it? Yes, of course they do. But I think in pretty much every industry, there's needs and requirements to either get more efficient or provide data in a more transparent and trustable way. And I think that and this is more from the blockchain side of things. Those are basically what blockchain is created to do: create peer-to-peer systems where data can be trusted and can be shared in a seamless way. And I go back to that statement I made about blockchain acting as kind of like the ultimate systems integration tool, because you can connect to different systems and then collect data throughout in a very light way. So it's not replacing systems, it's just augmenting them. I think maybe that's the point I'm trying to get to. And what we didn't discuss is, like, does blockchain replace supply chain management systems? And the answer to that's no. It augments and it supports and it makes the data potentially more trustworthy and certainly independently verifiable, which I think is something that most companies and certainly most consumers are increasingly looking for.
Great, superb. Matthew, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed on the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Yeah, there's two. Well, for me, LinkedIn is probably the best place. I'm pretty active there. And for that, I'm always sharing information about supply chain, about other areas of application for the technology. And of course, Settlemint's website, we have a library of mini books and guides, and we just recently finished the survey on this, let's say, the state of blockchain and supply chain.
Okay, cool.
So it'd be, if anyone wants to dig deeper and see, we did a survey of, was it 200 CIOs and CTOs that looked into blockchain and supply chain, and some really interesting findings there. Just to call out two of them, hopefully that'll pique your interest. But what was interesting, surprising for me, well, it was interesting, surprising, is that about 78% of companies have already done some form of experimentation with blockchain. Wow. And about half of them have done something in production. So there's a lot of, and that could be a limited pilot type experience. But, so it's interesting. I was actually encouraged to hear that, okay, it's getting a lot of steam throughout. And that wasn't only agriculture and or food and bev. So looking across. So it's happening out there. I think that the banks tend to be a lot more noisy about it, but supply chain and manufacturing, we're just getting on with it. So there's, just to round that off, there's a whole section on our website for useful insights into blockchain in different industries, the results of this recent survey for supply chain. And also Settlement's LinkedIn site is a good place to keep up with what's going on our side of the world.
Cool. I'll put links to those in the show notes as well. Great. Matthew, that's been fascinating. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and talk to you soon. Take care.